Many of you have heard the name Stuart Brand, who is kind of like a serial innovator in his own right, started the Whole Earth Catalog and the Well and many other sort of new economy innovations. But he's famous for one quote that's relevant to the introduction of our next speaker, which is the comment that information wants to be free. Now, you could read that in a number of ways. Free as in freedom free, or free as in don't pay free. It's open to your imagination. What we don't commonly remember is that Stuart also then followed up with a second quote, which is that information also wants to be expensive. So this whole notion of closed versus open, top-down versus bottom-up, the whole nature of what our kind of cyber environment, society is like today and where it is heading, fundamental set of issues having to do with intellectual property rights, having to do with sort of power dynamics as governments get more and more involved in the regulation of what, formerly was a wild and woolly frontier. And so Larry Lessig is really the foundational figure, I think, in terms of giving us a point of view and a set of frameworks and an intellectual understanding of what these issues of this new kind of frontier are in terms of intellectual property, in terms of the new dynamics. And with that, it's a real privilege to introduce Larry Lessig.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we need a picture of what the freedom to innovate is. And it's really wonderful to be here in Sweden because there is such a picture. The picture looks something like this. There was a Swedish guy. There was another guy from another country. I don't know what that guy was, but there was a Swedish guy behind this extraordinary innovation. And it is an extraordinary innovation against the background of what the world was like before. Because in the beginning of telecommunications infrastructure, all across the world, we had companies like this, companies that, they went through a lot of different branding. But the key to this company is that this company in the United States and similar companies around the world were a system. And what it meant to be a system was that the right to innovate for that system was controlled by the owner. And to innovate, you needed permission first from the owner. And if you had no permission, there was no innovation. So, for example, in the early history of the United States, 1921, the hushaphone was invented. This is a little metal device, the intent of which was to put on top of a telephone to make it easier to hear the person on the other side. But in 1948, the United States government blocked the distribution of the hushaphone. The reasoning of the government was use of a hushaphone affects more than the conversation of the user, that its influence pervades the whole telephone system. And what was that influence? The idea that somebody other than AT&T was allowed to innovate for the network. Okay, but then things changed. AT&T, or the equivalent networks, were crushed by the development of this thing called the Internet, which created a platform on top of which there has been endless innovation because the right to innovate is free, uncontrolled by anyone. No permission is necessary in order to innovate for this network because on this network we have complete capacity in the user themselves. So if Skype had decided to try to make a telephone call to the owners of the network to say to the network, hey, do you mind if we build an app that's going to absolutely destroy your business model? There was nobody on the other end of the telephone line who could have said anything in response because no one was there. There was no permission necessary. That was the internet. Network neutrality, the end-to-end principle in the internet guaranteed this freedom to innovate. Now, nobody planned that. Nobody intended it. It was an unintended consequence of a network design for other purposes, for other reasons it developed like this. But this is the point I want you to remember today. What the coders gave us, the lawyers can take away. Okay. So here's the argument, number one. I'm going to tell you some stories, actually 3 stories. First, about copyright. The opposite of copyright is the public domain. The idea that when copyright ends, assuming it ends, you're free to build upon the stuff that came from our past. This is the greatest instance of such creativity, Walt Disney, who through his extraordinary company built an extraordinary range of material that took stuff when it passed into the public domain or timed its release upon the release into the public domain to speak to new generations in a more powerful way. It's not yet clear today whether copyright's actually going to end anymore. We've seen extension after extension after extension of this. In the United States, 11 times in the last 40 years, we've extended the terms of existing copyrights. And the last time Congress did this, on October 27th, 1998, I decided I was going to become an activist in this field. So this statute, passed in honor of this great American, Sonny Bono, called the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. This is the otherwise known as Mickey Mouse Protection Act, because what in fact was happening was when Mickey Mouse was about to fall into the public domain, magically the copyright term was extended, so that no one could do to Disney Inc. what Walt Disney had done to the Brothers Grimm. Okay, but the question that Congress was supposed to be answering when it passed this statute was, did it advance the public good to extend the term of an existing copyright? And that question has a simple answer. This right-wing Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman, when we asked him to join a brief challenging this extension, said, so obvious was it that it could make no sense to extend the term of an existing copyright, he would only sign the brief if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. Because to extend the term of existing copyright could not advance the public good because copyrights are about creating incentives, and incentives in this universe at least are only prospective. No matter what the United States Congress does, George Gershwin is not going to produce anything more. So there is a no-brainer problem, Milton Friedman said, but apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress unanimously passed the extension of existing copyrights. What there was more than $6 million in campaign contributions from Disney and related interests, keen to see their copyright extended, the public good be damned. Okay. Number 2, spectrum. All across the world, spectrum is regulated. We were told it has to be regulated. We were told that by a lawyer. Might be something wrong here, but here it is. A lawyer, Supreme Court Justice, in the case of NBC versus United States, wrote, owing to its physical characteristics, radio, unlike other methods of conveying information, must be regulated and rationed by the government. Otherwise, there would be chaos, and radio's usefulness would be largely destroyed. This attitude gave us the equivalent of the Politburo for spectrum regulation in the United States, called the FCC. And the FCC then launched on its task of allocating radio spectrum, allocating it according to its judgment about what use was best. Well, about 13 years after this decision, Ronald Coase, Nobel Prize-winning economist, puzzled about this decision, said, look, the idea of spectrum granted as a government-granted privilege makes no sense. Why don't we just allocate it as property, like we allocate all scarce resources? So there, instead of being allocations, would be owners. The owners would then buy and sell spectrum, and that buying and sold spectrum would then constitute the way in which we used spectrum resources. No doubt, in my view, this would have been a much better way of using spectrum, assuming the way we use spectrum is technologies like this, loud broadcasts to wide swaths of the world. If that is the use, then Coase was right. But a little important and forgotten bit of this history is actually that 18 years before spectrum was propertized in the theories of Coase, this woman, Hedy Lamarr, invented a radically different way to allocate spectrum. Spectrum not as property, but spectrum as a shared resource, a spectrum commons. Through a patent that she received for allocating spectrum usages over time in a particular spectrum range, she demonstrated, and others then built upon it, that we could make it so that machines could share without any police cop being in the middle, so that there was no reason to license, no reason to own, spectrum, because spectrum in this sense could be shared. Now, people had this question, how is that possible? And when I first started talking about this issue around 2000, it was pretty hard to explain, because people's intuition about spectrum is a lot like they have the intuition about what would happen if two airplanes sort of came too close to each other. They would crash, like you're using your radio and my using my radio would produce interference. But today, it's simple to explain this, because the intuition is what's behind what we all know of as Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is a technology that enables machines to share the same spectrum space without any police officer in the middle saying, you get to use it now and then you get to use it later. It is code functioning now as law, which is allocating and making this shared resource possible. And indeed, some of the architects of this shared resource, this one in particular, who was also behind the architecture of the original internet, believes that we could build this so that more users would mean more capacity, so that the more people were using this shared resource, their devices themselves, this is echoing very strongly from the earlier conversation, could provide more capacity to the rest of the world. Okay, so I wrote a book about 10 years ago, in 2001, The Future of Ideas, and at that time, no one really knew which of these two models was right. The conventional wisdom about 2001 was therefore we needed to experiment. We needed to try the Stalin model, the Coase model, and the Hedy-Lamarr model, and let them fight against each other and see which one turned out to be the best way to allocate spectrum usage. So, knock ahead about a decade. Where are we in this debate? Well, these three models have now been displaced by basically one model. And the process for bringing that about is very much a process like this. As the government regulator, he's the roach, has been moved by these petty little lobbyists towards a very obvious conclusion, which is, who is going to make money in a world where spectrum is free? And so very quickly, over the past decade, we've seen the new normal become unfree spectrum, because unfree spectrum allows those who are able to hire those lobbyists to produce a spectrum world where they make an extraordinary amount of money. Ideas be damned, evidence be damned. This is what drives the policy. One final example. Broadband in the United States sucks. That's a technical legal term, sucks. Really, really bad. So here, any number of measures on it. Here's where the United States stands. Countries like Sweden are all the way at the other ends. Even France beats the United States in allocation and access to broadband. Now, of course, it sucks on average. The states in the United States vary very differently. This is the worst state in the United States, North Carolina. Even though it has some of the most important innovation centers in the country, Research Triangle, which includes Red Hat, it is the worst in the nation, dead last in access to internet speeds at what the SEC defines as broadband, which is 200 kilobytes a second, which you guys here would think of as really, really bad broadband. Okay. Now, the reason in every one of these cases for this slow broadband is basically monopoly power. There's little competition. There's poor competition, basically no competition in the United States to provide broadband in many areas in the country. And what that yields is sucky broadband. And the solution is competition. So states like North Carolina decided they would begin to produce competition. They had these communities which created their own broadband infrastructure and began to license it out to providers who would make it accessible to businesses and consumers. And here was a graph that tries to capture this. It's pretty easy to get the intuition here. These are the monopoly providers. The fact that they're at the bottom and big bubbles means that they're expensive and slow. These were the community-provided broadband infrastructures. Fast, symmetrical, fiber infrastructure that was beginning to provide broadband at the levels that the rest of the world should expect. So what was the response to North Carolina's response? Well, very quickly, the monopoly providers raced to the North Carolina legislature and got them to introduce a scary-sounding bill, the Level Playing Field Local Government Competition Act, which essentially bans governments from facilitating competition in broadband by building their own infrastructure to provide broadband service. And why is it that the state of North Carolina, the worst state in the country, would pass a law that guarantees it will remain as the worst state in the country? Well, lots of puzzling questions about that. But just 2 months ago, this institute released a study that tried to suggest maybe why this was true. And what the study concludes is that if you were a legislator receiving money from these telecom companies, you could receive 5 times the amount of money anybody else received if you were a supporter of this particular change, again, in money. Okay, now, what's the obvious point about all 3 here? It's the same story. All 3 of these are a story of money to an incumbent provider, which inspires that incumbent to fight an endless war by that incumbent using the government to protect itself. That is the story, I'm afraid, of my country, the United States. And why is that the description of policymaking in the United States? There's a simple word to describe it. The word is corrupt. Now, when I use that word, especially outside of the country, we're not allowed to criticize America outside of the country, so don't tell anybody, okay? When I use that word corrupt, I want to be very precise. I don't mean brown paper bag corruption. I don't mean kind of Rob Blagojevich kind of corruption. I don't mean people violating any law. I don't mean illegal corruption. What I mean is legal corruption. Our system is legally corrupt. It's corrupt relative to the baseline of what our system was supposed to be. The framers of our Constitution gave us what they called a republic, but by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 described it, a government that would have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. Okay, so here's their model of government. There's the people, there's the government. I do my own slides. It's cool the way that bounces like that, right? Okay. The people and the government, an exclusive dependency. But here's the problem. Our Congress has evolved a very different dependence, no longer just a dependence upon the people, increasingly a dependence upon the funders. Members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. They develop in that process, as any of us would, a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. In the words of the X-Files, they become shapeshifters as they constantly adjust their view in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes them. When she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. Now the point is, this is a dependence too, but it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone because, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. 0.26% of Americans, I know you're thinking as a lawyer doesn't know how to do percentages, but I really mean 0.26%, 1/4% of Americans give more than $200 in a congressional election. 0.05 give the maximum amount to any candidate permitted. 0.01, the 1% of the 1% give $10,000 or more. And my favorite statistic from this cycle so far, 0.00015%, that's 47 Americans, have given 42% of the super PAC money that has been spent in the presidential cycle to date. Right? So the Occupy Wall Street people are so proud of their 99% statistic. Bad marketing. They are the 99.74%, or the 99.95%, or the 99.99%, or the 99.99985%, depending on which of these numbers you want to grasp to measure just how insignificant their influence is, because they are not the funders. This is corruption. It is corruption in the most obvious sense that the framers would have understood because it produces an institution that is not responsive to the influence it was supposed to be responsive to, the people. And this corruption has an effect. Number one, most Americans believe, and I think they're right to believe, but it's a separate question. They believe money buys results in Congress. 75% of Americans believe money buys results in Congress. A little bit higher Democrats than Republicans. But I guarantee you, before the Republicans took control of the House, it was just as many Republicans as Democrats. So whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, here's the one thing we Americans all believe. Money buys results in Congress. Leading to point number 2, that belief erodes trust in the institution of Congress. ABC and the New York Times last year published a statistic that said 9% of Americans had confidence in Congress. 9%. Now, to put that in some context, it's certainly the case at the time of the American Revolution, more Americans had confidence in the British Crown than have confidence in our Congress today. And that leads to point number 3, that erosion erodes participation in the system. So, Rock the Vote, which registers and turns out young voters, and registered and turned out the largest number of young voters in 2008, guaranteeing Barack Obama the election, found in 2010 a significant number of their voters were just not going to turn out. So they asked them why. The number one reason by far, 2-1 over the second highest reason, was no matter who wins, corporate interest will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids. The vast majority of people who could have voted in 2010 did not vote, in part, at least, because of this belief. Okay, now, so what this means is policy in the United States becomes the function of the politically active, but the vast majority of sensible people are not the politically active. The politically active increasingly are the crazies inside of the American system. The crazies who begin to define the public policy in the way that crazy American public policy develops. Okay, so you say, so what? Why should you care? Why should Europe care? Well, it's for the obvious reason. Our craziness is not costless to you. We, in the United States, I believe, have literally lost the capacity to govern. We have lost it because we have a system now where the tiniest slice of the 1% effectively has the capacity to block any substantial reform. Pick your issue. We cannot decide that issue in a sensible way. Not even the Democratic Party in the United States Senate could get unanimous support for global warming legislation. We will never address global warming or a sensible healthcare policy or a sensible tax system or the deficit or food safety or any issue you care about, let alone copyright or network neutrality, because of the corruption of the system. If you stand back and connect the dots with all of the areas of policy that we can't get right, it's obvious here there is a root cause, and that root cause is this corruption. Now, against the power of government corrupted, what we need is balanced and sensible alternatives to the policies corrupted government advances. What we need is resistance, and resistance from you. We need you to resist us. Now, I know you're thinking, well, we're not actually the most uncorrupted government. You're only number 4. Your neighbors are actually less corrupted. So, because you're the corrupt brother of this little area of the country, but you're still really, really good, right? There's no corruption here comparable to what I'm talking about. Indeed, I once spoke at your parliament and went to dinner with one of your members of parliament, and he said to me, I have literally never once asked anybody for money, never once, and couldn't imagine what it would mean to be a representative who spent 30 or 40 or 50% of your time in the business of raising money. So this system needs to teach my system. You can speak sensibly. Now, our extremism will bleed here. It already has. The copyright extremism that increasingly becomes the mantra of governments around the world, to the spectrum medievalism, which is increasingly becoming the pattern of governance around the world, to the anti-network neutrality movement, which is increasingly saying, no, the network that allowed Skype to develop, that was for the old days. Now we need managed, controlled resources that the owners of the platform, once again, can exercise control over. That craziness will bleed everywhere. So you need to help us you need to teach us, you need to shame us to become something more. The world cannot afford US craziness, and neither the freedom to innovate. Thank you very much.
So I'd like to kick off the discussion by asking Larry about another form of corruption. I was as I mentioned earlier, in Moscow recently and met with some deputy minister types in the telecommunications part of government, and they were pointing to the inevitability of more internet regulation because of the need to control kind of inconvenient members of society who might be, playing guitars and speaking out against the regime at the same time. The other visit that was somewhat relevant to this theme was in Washington, D.C., and people in the national security community are beating the drums loudly about cyber warfare and the need for further investment in that area. And of course, one of the corollaries of that is more control. So, one could foresee a balkanization of the internet, the fragmentation of it, the, putting up of barriers and stuff. And how does that kind of government corruption, if we can use that word, play into where we might be going?
Well, I think that, the Russia story is different from the American story.
Sure. Or the Singapore story, or the, whatever story, right?
And so, and there are places in the world where it's illegal corruption, which is dominant, and places in the world where it's legal corruption is dominant. And they will both affect the future of the internet dramatically. Now, there are people who think that what we need is a completely unregulated internet. I'm not one of those people, right? I believe that the law is necessary to, protect rights, to protect against violence, to protect against injury. So I'm not against regulation. I'm against stupid regulation, where stupid means regulation designed to protect an incumbent against competitors. And what we've seen is that regulation developing and dramatically overwhelming spheres of potential innovation. I just read this really wonderful paper which went back to all of the venture capitalists who had been investing in the field of copyright-related startups around 1999 and 2000, and tried to gauge what the consequence of the war, the copyright war, was on innovation and the willingness to invest in this field. And what they described is the death zone, the space where there was no innovation permitted because people were terrified about the consequences of the kickback from regulation. And the regulation was being pushed not by people who were thinking about what's the best way to protect artists. It was pushed by people who are trying to think about what's the best way to protect business models that have been developed in the 20th century and some in the 19th century, right? So this was the corruption of a process that led to regulation that was crazy. Now, I think same thing in the security issue. My friend John Zittrain has written a really fantastic book, The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. And one of the dynamics in this book is recognizing how the Internet's building all of this infrastructure for control. And when we have what we could think of as an I-9/11 event, which is not Al-Qaeda taking down the Internet, but some dramatic event, there will be the political will necessary to kick in the system of control necessary to change the Internet, to flip the character of the Internet. And I had dinner once with one of the cyber security guys from the government, and I said to him, many of us were surprised after 9/11 that there was the Patriot Act, that within 10 days, this 1,000-page statute could be written and passed. And he said, yeah, well, of course, that statute had been sitting in the drawers of the FBI for many, many years waiting for the... And so I said, okay, is there an iPatriot Act? Is there a Patriot Act waiting for some event like this that will then give the government the... And he said, of course there is. And Vint Cerf, one of the original architects of the Internet, is not going to like it very much. Right? So here again, this is not so much corruption in the way that I'm talking about. It's just stupidity in the way that I'm talking about, because there is a way, I think, to architect a network that would better protect privacy and better protect security. But nobody has the interest to do it, and the government doesn't have the capacity to push it. Maybe the government doesn't have the interest to do it, because the government doesn't actually want more privacy focused internet. It makes it harder for them to do that.
It's an inconvenient question.
It's inconvenient for them. That's right. Yeah.
So it's pretty gloomy prospect then. Because, I mean, some of the things that you're describing as being catalytic events are actually almost inevitable.
Yeah, they're certainly inevitable.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But there's until they happen, there's still time for people to try to push the recognition and the understanding enough so that when it happens, there's somebody who can stand on the other side, or people who stand on the other side.
Yeah, but it begs the question of platform, which is a really interesting question of, where would that conversation and that work take place? Because you couldn't imagine it being necessarily effective just if it's a crowdsourced, popular expression of sentiment. I mean, smart people have to do some concerted work that is persuasive, because they have to influence by the power of ideas, since they don't have formal power to command change. And where is that work going to happen? I mean, maybe the center at Harvard's doing this, I guess.
Well, there are a lot of people who are doing the work. The question is whether it gets buy-in from the people who have the influence inside of the United States government. And if the government is as I've described it, the people who have the buy-in are the people with the cash here, and they don't necessarily have the interest in the most sensible. They've had the interest in preserving and protecting themselves. And there's a basic step backwards to the government basically in the business of protecting themselves. But, I'm actually very optimistic about other places around the world able to have a sensible judgment because they don't have the same kind of corruption inside of it. And that's the plea. The plea at the end of this talk is that there are places, well-functioning democracies that are capable of thinking about things like this and need to be engaged and stop being bullied by, this crazy, which I'm afraid too often our government is.
So, what are your thoughts and questions? I mean, we could go on for hours, I think, because this is a very rich topic. Any burning interventions here that anyone wants to put on the table? Okay.
All the way over here.
Thomas is getting a good workout today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful talk. My name's Tony Turner from Linköping University here in Sweden. I've got a two-part question. The first part of the question, if you answer one way or the other, will kill the second part of the question. But I'm guessing you're a supporter of open access publishing in academia?
Yes.
Then I can go to my second point.
Okay.
It seems to me that's one thing. You talked about things creeping. And that's something that's certainly crept over here now with our European Commission pushing open access publishing in academia. But if you're right about money pushing things, is this not a naive approach? Because it pushes the money towards pay to publish instead of pay to read. And people are already springing up, taking advantage of that. So what seems simply a good message, because of the power of money, is turning into an even more corrupt approach.
Yeah, so so you found an area where I'm not pessimistic. So here, I'm not pessimistic about that. Because what we've seen is, as people have tried to provide infrastructure to support open access publishing, which guarantees that people have free access to the material published, they've discovered that you've got to cover the cost someplace, so they're going to cover the cost in paying to get it published. And the leader in this, the Public Library of Science, which has produced some of the most influential journals in, for example, the context of medicine, Public Science PLOS Medicine is now one of the most influential journals out there, has a policy that says if you want to publish, you're going to pay this amount of money. But they also have a policy set that says, we will never block somebody from publishing because they don't have the money. So they have some way to subsidize that. And what that does is it shifts the focus of libraries and research grants to make sure that they have the publication costs up front. I think that's a better way to allocate the costs, because what we know is that if it costs anything, you basically block access to the vast majority of the world. So I did this experiment where I was triggered to do this experiment because this Harvard economist gave an interview, and in the course of the interview, she was asked, why aren't there any books on your shelves? And she says, well, everything I want is on the internet now. So I went to Google Scholar, and I searched campaign finance, the issue that I was talking about. And I got the top 10 articles. And I went through the top 10 articles, and I asked, if I were not a Harvard person, how accessible would these articles be? And of the top 10, there was only one that was freely accessible, and only if I signed up to pay for a subscription after 1 year. Okay, so every one of the other ones was $39, $49, $35, extraordinary cost for a normal person that would try to get access to that. Now, what does it mean to say everything's free on the internet? It means if you are privileged enough to be a Harvard professor, or maybe a Harvard student, or maybe a student at a rich American university, you get whatever you want because they have, basically subscribed in a way that gets access to this freely. But if you're not one of those privileged sorts, if you're the rest of the world, you basically can't get access to this material legally because the costs are just completely prohibitive. So I think we ought to be shifting it so that we who can afford to pay for the publication, and the rest of the world then has access to the information. That was the idea of the Enlightenment. And because we've seen so many competitors in this context, unlike the domination that we've seen in physical publishers, where there are one or two dominant physical publishers, there are many. And this platform provides extraordinary competition for the publishers. I think we're going to see plenty of competition that keeps that initial cost down. So I'm all for it, and I think we ought to be pushing it. And I think we, as scholars, have an ethical obligation to push it, because the idea that I would publish something that would not be accessible to the people who need it. I'm a lawyer, so nobody needs what I publish. But if I were a doctor, the idea I would write an article about malaria treatments and publish it in a way that people who are actually living in countries with malaria just could not afford it is outrageous. And we ought to be organizing ourselves to say we have an ethical obligation to make our stuff available, and this is the way we can do it.
So we have time for one more. Go for it.
So I have a 25-year-old daughter, well-educated, who is not going to vote in the next election, to my maddeningness, because of that reason. And so I know about your work, and so are you thinking that you're going to be able to overrule this through grassroots change? And I'm wondering is there a 9/11 around this issue that would provoke these guys to act?
Yeah. So the answer is, if it's going to get changed, it only will get changed through a grassroots movement. One of my friends, Congressman Jim Cooper, who's been in Congress for as long as all but about 20 other members of Congress, says the problem with Congress has become a kind of farm league for K Street. K Street is where the lobbyists live. So they have a business model, and their business model is, I'm going to serve as a member of Congress, and I'm going to step out and become a lobbyist. And when they step out and become a lobbyist, United Republic calculated their average salary increase is 1,452%. Right? Okay. So that means everybody inside the Beltway, members and staffers and bureaucrats, has a business model focused on supporting the system as it is. So you ask them to vote to change the system, so lobbyists didn't have that kind of influence. Very few of them would ever do it. So the only way is to imagine this kind of outside the Beltway movement developing. And there have been, I think, glimmers of that kind of movement happening. Obviously, in your field, you see it happening all the time to provide service and great products to people. That's what the internet has enabled, and we understand its social and commercial component. But there's a political component, too. And we've seen it happen, I count 4 or 5 times in the last 5 years. I think the Tea Party was one example. I don't agree with them, but I think that was one example. I think the Occupy movement was another example. I think the extraordinary fact that they organized to block the SOPA and PIPA statutes, the latest round of Hollywood lockdown regulation, which when the lobbyists took it to Capitol Hill, they were absolutely certain they would win because they had the signed commitment of 60 senators to support it. And within a month, it was blown up because millions of people from around the world, said this is outrageous, especially after Wikipedia shut down for a day saying this is outrageous. So that was an instance of all of a sudden people on the left and the right recognizing they need to get together. Now, here's the real problem. American politics is extremely polarized. American media is extremely polarized. That's because the business model of polarization pays. It pays to hate the enemy and to talk down the enemy and to make the enemy sound like evil. And that's how you get a really rallied base, and that's how you succeed in your niche of this movement. This kind of change requires a cross-partisan movement. It's got to feel neither left nor right. It's got to feel like the sort of thing that's not left side versus right side, but outside versus inside. And it's very hard for people, people in the United States, I think, to even think about how to act in a way that doesn't feel deeply partisan. So when we've tried to organize these cross-partisan movements, I went to an Occupy event and I spoke to the Occupy people and Occupy DC, and I said, you need to invite Tea Partiers down here and talk about crony capitalism. If you did that, thousands of Tea Partiers would be here. And it was like scripted in Hollywood. A guy raised his hand and he said, I was one of the founders of the Tea Party movement, and I run a site called againstcronycapitalism.com. And I guarantee you, if you talked about crony capitalism, there would be thousands of Tea Partiers down here. And so I thought, okay, my work is done. I'll go home and the revolution will occur because now that this 2 and 2 has been put together. But 2 weeks after that, a writer for The Nation started writing these articles attacking me for the outrageous suggestion that the Occupy movement should talk to the racists of the Tea Party. And I responded, I said, I'm not a mathematician, I'm a lawyer, but let's just see if we can do the numbers. You say you speak for the 99%. Okay, so we start with 100%. You subtract the 20% of Americans who call themselves supporters of the Tea Party because they're racist. How are you left with 99% that you presume to be speaking for, right? How does that math work? And the reason he wants to speak like that is, it gets us rallied up against the other side, but we need to find a way to get people rallied up against the inside and recognize that people on the outside are the only people who have the capacity to do that. It's extremely hard. I don't know if we can do it, but I know that's what we have to do.
Okay, with that, I think we've got to move on. So thank you again very much.